I love this graphic, P factor, the disease state. It's pretty complicated, but when you look at it, it's really just the idea of these 7 factors working together. You've got peroxynitrite, which is the initial sort of cause. It's what's being triggered by some environmental toxin. And then it starts to create some other biofactor activity. And when it does that, there's an interaction going on. It might create some oxidative stress and chronic inflammation, but then chronic inflammation creates some more peroxynitrite, on and on and on. So this graphic is really to illustrate the interconnectedness of these 7 factors, these 6 biofactors of peroxynitrite, and how they feed each other. And as we discussed, when you get to mitochondrial dysfunction, you have a whole new factory for peroxynitrite in itself. So when you think about chronic disease, it's easy to understand why it's chronic, why it continues. Environmental factors are persistent, so those factors are going to constantly aggravate your immune system. They're going to aggravate your peroxynitrite creation and oxidative stress. But even if you take those environmental factors out of the equation, you move to Mars, you're still going to have a chronic state that needs to be calmed down. So we talk about autoimmune disease often, and people say, well, gosh, it's your immune system attacking itself. The question, is it? Because if you look at P factor and see how the interactivity of these factors continue to perpetuate a disease that does stimulate your immune system, that does create more and more inflammation, and then again your immune system reacts. Is it the immune system attacking itself, or is it something like this P factor model? We have to discover more about what these models mean. But the P factor model gives us a skeleton, something to look at, something for scientists to go after, and put a peg in the wall and say, does this really exist? So here's the chain of causation. We talked about it a little bit. You've got the environmental toxin. It triggers the peroxynitrite, that bad little molecule that the NIH scientists found. And then it creates P factor, this swirling around of negative activity that's destroying so many important processes of your body. Who knew? And then the chronic disease comes. So what's interesting about P factor is while it can be measured, it's expensive. And you can measure the components of it. You can measure the levels of peroxynitrite through one tool. You can measure your inflammation through other tools. But this would be thousands of dollars just to find out what your status is. But there's a diagnostic here in the offing. So somewhere in time, doctors will give you a test for a P factor index. And that will be a predictor of disease, and also it'll be an evaluation of your current state. How am I doing today? Now, we don't have those tools today. They're not cheap, and we're looking to see how those things might develop. But in the meantime, how do you know? Well, you know because modern stress symptoms start prevailing in your life. Fatigue, anxiety, sleep issues, pain, mood swings. Sound familiar? I love this one, carb cravings. Who doesn't have carb cravings at 3 in the afternoon? It's either coffee or carbs, right? Brain fog, and the lower sex drive. Where did that come from? Well, actually, each one of these symptoms is a characteristic of P factor, and it can be derived, the biomedical, biochemical reactions that are going on internally can be described to show how each one presents. As you can probably guess, fatigue is a mitochondrial dysfunction. There's no ATP happening, and so I don't have my energy, I don't have my gas, and therefore I'm run down and I'm not thinking well. And brain fog is part of that too. But each one of these biofactors finds its way into a symptom, and there's probably 40. We call these new modern stress symptoms, we just think that's part of modern society. It's the kids, it's school, it's work, it's relationship, it's family, it's finances, on and on and on. Traffic. So we blame these external factors and say, I'm stressed. And it's true, these things exist. But think about it. If your biochemistry is disrupted and it's creating the environment for stress, internal stress, biological stress, This biological stress weakens your ability to deal with emotional stress, mental stress, all these things that we have to deal with. And so suddenly we're a mess. And so now you can see what's happening internally in this new age of disease. We all have these chronic symptoms. Many of us have these chronic diseases and disorders, and we're not as well as we should be. Once, we were the healthiest nation on earth, but now something's changed. So we're trying to put together a new model of disease for the 21st century. This is not one based on infectious disease. This is not about cancer and heart disease, although those conditions do tie in nicely with what we're looking at. But really, what does the new model look like? So this is one shot at that. This is one try, the first try. Back in 2011, the CDC said, we need to come up with a new model for the 21st century disease. So this is our shot at trying to say, what's happening internally and how is it presenting itself to us in the public? So as you can see, there's new areas of disease. Autoimmune disease, we've never heard of it before the 1990s. People, the term was pretty much unknown. Now everyone's clear. 50 million people or more are suffering. 100 new autoimmune diseases. They're very obscure. A lot of them present with the same kind of characteristics. Some are popular, like MS is well known. Diabetes has a piece of this equation. But essentially, this is a new category. And it's affecting hundreds of millions of people. You know, ultimately, there's a core 50 that are known, but the unreported number is extremely high. Neurological is the scary one. Because in neurological, we throw that together, the psychiatric, the depression, the moods, the bipolar disorder, even suicide. These are all things that we call psychiatric or mental illness or mental disease. But guess what? The same characteristics that match up with autism and Alzheimer's and MS and a lot of these neurological conditions that we see as neurodegenerative are the exact same sort of baseline that these mental diseases happen. So there's two things going on. There's something happening around you in your environment, your behavior and your experiences. But there's also this biological underpinning. It's really interesting. Two more categories. One's the inflammatory area. This inflammatory disease pretty much overarch a lot of the neurological and autoimmune, so it's nothing new. And then this metabolic piece. And metabolic is pretty much two main categories: obesity and diabetes 1. This is when your metabolism isn't working well. There's the mitochondria as part of that, but we take sugars in, we take oxygen in. We're supposed to convert all this to energy. And this whole idea of metabolic process is undermined. And so we have hundreds of millions of people suffering from that. So as you can see, a $2.7 trillion problem. It's more than 2/3 of our national budget. We're suffering from medical costs, psychic costs, lost productivity. There's a little research in there, not much. We've got a big problem, and it really can be solved. The reason it can be solved is because peroxynitrite is a known molecule that can be scavenged. And we'll talk more about how that can be scavenged. That means it can be destroyed. And there are natural ways to do this. And we really have to understand more. Why don't we know? Why don't we know more about peroxynitrite? NIH created this incredible paper in 2008. I think it should be a Nobel Prize winning paper. And it's a powerful message to the science community that one molecule can be this damaging. Medical community doesn't know, the greater population doesn't know, and yet we have an opportunity to not only identify this molecule at the heart of disease, but also to eradicate it. So what triggers peroxynitrite? Now let's talk about what's outside. They call it exogenous. What's on the outside? So three major suspects out there, and there could be many, many more, but let's talk about three that seem to be rising to the occasion. One is probably the most troubling. That's electromagnetic radiation. Microwave radiation from wireless devices triggers the immune system, and it's become prolific in our environment, and we're putting more and more technology into our lives. more devices, more sensors, more technology that actually creates this automated world we're living in. It's all great. But at the same time, what's that doing to our bodies, our health? We're electrical creatures. How does it play into the equation? The second category is chemicals. And we know that chemicals and pesticides and things like that are prolific, and we try to avoid them. But back in about 1990, one specific chemical was added to some of the crops, like wheat and corn and soybeans, to accelerate the harvest, to ripen faster. That's really what it was about. It's called glyphosate. And glyphosate is really popularly known as Roundup. You may use that in your yard. It's a very toxic substance. There is a good deal of legal activity going around on glyphosate now, and hopefully it'll be out of our food supply soon. But around 1990 is when it started coming into the food supply, just like at around 1990 where wireless started beginning. So we have two big trends, one in chemicals and one in electromagnetic radiation, that started just about the same time that these diseases began to take off. Now that's associative, that's correlative, that doesn't mean causative. So we need to go further to prove whether one of these two exogenous factors is really part of the equation. The third is obvious. We've heard for that forever. Sugar in your diet, and it's especially high fructose corn syrup. Very poisonous. When I talked to the scientists at NIH, I talked to Dr. Palpatcher on the NIH paper. I asked him, what's causing all this peroxynitrite? How is it that all these diseases are exploding, and where do we get off?